The walls were too close. Noah Carter stood in the center of his room, his breath hitching in the heavy, stagnant air. Every surface was bare. No camera stands, no reflectors, no softboxes to diffuse the harsh overhead light. Outside, the city hummed with a rhythm he was not yet a part of. He looked at the blank wall before him, the white paint chipped near the baseboard, and the silence began to pull at him. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled. He checked the time. Most people would have walked away, citing the lack of a studio or the absence of a crew. He stood his ground. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he paced the 3-foot span from the bed to the door. He was not looking for a way out. He was looking for a way forward. He reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the metal frame of his device. The room felt smaller now, charged with a sudden, sharp focus. He stopped pacing and turned back to the center of the room. The blank wall was no longer an obstacle. It was a canvas. He took a single step toward it and reached out to set the stage for a future that only he could see. Others talked about lenses. They talked about lighting rigs, sound stages, and the necessity of a production crew to make anything worth watching. Noah heard them everywhere. He saw the forums, the complaints, the endless lists of equipment that stood as barriers between an idea and a reality. He held his phone in both hands. The metal was cool against his palms. He felt the weight of it, not as a flimsy consumer toy, but as a bridge. He ignored the voices that claimed he was under-equipped. He ignored the lack of a studio. He stepped into the center of the frame he had mentally mapped out on the wall. He did not look for a switch to turn on a light. He simply moved until the shadow fell behind him. His thumb hovered over the screen. The screen illuminated his face, a soft, blue glow in the dim room. He took a breath, leveled his gaze, and pressed the record icon. There was no fanfare, no countdown, just the steady, rhythmic pulse of the timer icon as it began to count upward. He had started. The silence of the room was broken by the quiet, mechanical hum of his own intent. He stood perfectly still, waiting for the first word to leave his lips. He stopped the recording and tapped the screen to play it back. The sound hit him first. A thin, sharp hiss of static bled through the audio, burying his voice under a layer of white noise. He frowned, leaning in to hear the words he had spoken with such conviction. They were barely audible, distorted by the poor acoustics of the room. He watched the screen. The image stuttered, jumping from frame to frame as the processor struggled to keep up with the movement. The lighting was even worse than he had imagined. One side of his face was washed out in a harsh, clinical glare, while the other side sank into a deep, muddy shadow. He watched his own gestures, stiff and awkward on the tiny display. The editing was jerky, a series of uneven cuts that made the sequence feel frantic and disjointed. He let the video loop twice, staring at the flaws. Each loop was a reminder of how far he had to go. The silence returned to the room, heavier than before. He felt the sting of the failure, a cold weight in his chest. The screen went dark, reflecting only his own tired gaze back at him. It was a disaster, and he knew it. Noah did not look away. He kept his eyes on the dead screen, forcing himself to analyze every jagged cut and distorted syllable. Frustration rose, but he pushed it down. He stood up, paced the length of the room, and repeated a single thought. Focus on the solution, not the obstacle. The static was a technical problem, not a character flaw. The lighting was a matter of positioning, not a lack of equipment. He turned back to the room with a different intent. He shoved the desk 3 inches to the left to catch the ambient light from the window. He draped a thin white cloth over the lamp to soften the glare. He cleared the clutter from the background, creating a clean, neutral space. He reset the focus on his phone, locking the exposure to prevent the flickering. His movements were precise, stripped of the earlier hesitation. He stood in the center, took a steadying breath, and reached out. His finger hovered over the record button once more. This time, there was no doubt. He pressed it. The timer started. He began to speak, his voice clearer, his posture anchored. He had turned the failure into a template for the next attempt. He was no longer just recording, he was building. The sun became a stranger. Noah traded his hours of sleep for the blue flicker of a laptop screen. He spent his nights dissecting editing software, dragging timelines and trimming seconds until his eyes burned and his shoulders locked in a permanent hunch. He did not know the names of the tools, so he learned through trial and error. He clicked every icon, adjusted every slider, and watched the software crash more times than he could count. Each time the program froze, he restarted it, his jaw set, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the desk. He drank cold coffee to keep his mind sharp, the bitter taste grounding him when the exhaustion threatened to pull him under. He mastered the ripple edit, then the color grade, then the sound mix. One night, after 6 hours of fighting a single transition, he finally made the clips snap together perfectly. The screen showed a smooth, seamless sequence. He leaned back, his pulse steady, feeling the weight of his growing skill. It was a silent, private victory. He looked at the clock, saw the first gray light of dawn filtering through the blinds, and felt no fatigue. He felt dangerous. He had learned the language of his craft, and he was no longer just a spectator to his own vision. Noah left the bedroom. He traded the controlled silence of his desk for the unpredictable chaos of the street. He carried his phone like a weapon. He approached a local florist and asked for a minute of her time, framing the shot against the vibrant colors of the display. The wind buffeted his microphone, forcing him to shield it with his hand and adjust his position to block the noise. He filmed a neighborhood chess match. Crouching low to find the right angle as hands moved pieces across the board, he spent afternoons at small storefronts, capturing the rhythm of local commerce. Every interview was a test. He learned to read the light on the fly, moving his subjects to avoid harsh shadows. He learned to listen through the ambient roar of traffic to ensure the dialogue remained crisp. His hands grew steady. His framing became intuitive. He returned home each evening with a digital archive of life, a library of moments that proved he could capture anything. He reviewed the footage, noting the subtle improvements in his pacing and the clarity of his sound. Each gig was a brick in a wall he was building one frame at a time. The work was demanding, messy, and constant, but with every file he exported, the gap between his vision and his output narrowed. He was no longer just learning, he was producing. Noah stood in the cramped back office of a local hardware store, his laptop open on a cluttered workbench. The owner, a man with calloused hands and a skeptical expression, watched the screen. Noah held his breath. The video played a 60-second sequence of the store's daily rhythm, the shelves, the tools, the staff assisting customers. Every cut was deliberate, goals for time. The owner leaned forward, his eyes tracking the motion on the screen. He did not speak for a long minute. Noah felt the vibration of the refrigerator in the corner and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The silence stretched until it felt heavy. Then, the owner nodded. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick, folded envelope, and placed it on the workbench between them. He pushed the envelope toward Noah with a firm tap of his finger. Noah picked it up. He felt the weight of the bills inside the first tangible proof that his labor held market value. He did not smile. He simply exhaled, a long, slow release of tension that had been building for months. He tucked the payment into his bag, his movements precise and calm. He had crossed the threshold from amateur to professional, and as he stepped out into the afternoon sun, the world felt smaller, more manageable, and entirely his to shape. Noah walked past a storefront window displaying watches and leather goods. He stopped. The envelope in his pocket carried enough cash to buy a piece of comfort, a small reward for the months of sleepless nights. He looked at his reflection in the glass, then turned away and kept walking. He had a different destination. He entered a specialized audio shop, the scent of ozone and plastic filling the air. He walked straight to the display cases, ignoring the high-end cameras and lenses that were still beyond his reach. He pointed to a directional microphone with a heavy, professional-grade casing. The clerk placed the box on the counter. Noah counted out the bills, his hands steady. He did not hesitate. As he walked out with the equipment, the weight of the box felt significant. It was not just a tool, it was an investment in his own output. That night, he set up the new microphone in his room. He tested the levels, watching the digital waveforms dance across his screen with a newfound clarity. The ambient room noise was gone. The crispness of his own voice startled him. He realized then that every dollar earned would be funneled back into the craft. He had committed to a cycle where the work would always come first. He adjusted the gain, pressed record, and started again. The new microphone was just the beginning. Noah spent the following weeks obsessively testing light angles, using cardboard sheets to bounce natural sun through his window. It was never enough. He needed precision. He returned to the store, this time for a tripod. He hauled the heavy metal frame into his bedroom, setting it up in the center of the floor. Suddenly, the room felt less like a place to sleep and more like a place to create. He locked the camera into the mount. The image on his monitor was finally still. No more jitter. No more motion blur. He moved to his next target, lighting. He scoured online listings until he found a set of professional panels. When they arrived, he mounted them to the walls and cleared his desk to make space for the control board. He adjusted the color temperature, watching as the harsh shadows of his bedroom disappeared, replaced by clean, even illumination. He stood back, surveying the space. Cables ran neatly along the baseboards. The walls were now lined with gear cases. Every piece of equipment in the room was a physical manifestation of his commitment. He sat down, adjusted the frame, and the camera lens caught his reflection. The amateur was gone, replaced by a technician who understood that light and stability were the foundations of his craft. The bedroom studio became a launchpad. Noah shifted his focus from local business spots to regional documentaries, moving his equipment out of the house and into the field. He spent weeks researching locations, mapping out interviews, and coordinating travel schedules. The scale of his work increased. On his first major regional project, he faced a massive logistical hurdle when the primary interview location lost power mid-shoot. The client paced the room, watching the clock. Noah did not panic. He had anticipated the potential for failure. He pulled a portable power bank and backup LED light panels from his kit, reconfiguring the entire set in under 5 minutes. The interview resumed. The footage was crisp, the lighting perfectly balanced despite the circumstances. When the documentary aired, the feedback was immediate. Colleagues reached out, curious about his process and his equipment. He was no longer just a creator working from a desk, he was a production partner for regional organizations. The stakes grew with every contract he signed. He spent his days scouting mountain trails and industrial sites, hauling equipment cases into remote areas to capture the reality of the stories he sought to tell. Each project was a test of endurance. He was building a reputation, and with it, the demand for higher-end, complex content grew. The transition from solo operator to company lead was not gradual. It arrived in the form of overflowing email inboxes and back-to-back client briefings. Noah found himself spending more time in boardrooms than behind the lens. The pressure was no longer just about framing the perfect shot. It was about managing payroll, insurance, and the expectations of high-end corporate clients. He hired his first assistant to handle the logistics, but the responsibility remained his to carry. Every morning, he arrived at his office 2 hours before the staff to review the daily production schedules. He felt the weight of the company in the stack of signed contracts on his desk. When a major project hit a snag, he stopped delegating and stepped back into the field, handling the camera himself to ensure the vision remained intact. He refused to let the corporate structure dilute the grit that built the business. He maintained a strict, unrelenting pace, often working through the night to solve technical glitches that his team could not resolve. He was operating 2 lives simultaneously, the lead technician in the studio and the executive overseeing the bottom line. He refined his workflow until every minute was accounted for, turning the chaos of rapid growth into a disciplined, repeatable process. The production firm solidified into a permanent fixture of the regional landscape. Noah moved his operations into a dedicated studio complex, complete with sound-dampened suites and rows of high-end editing terminals. His staff list grew to 20, each member focused on a specific aspect of the production cycle. The unpredictability of the early years was replaced by steady, high-volume output. Noah oversaw the final cut of every project, his presence in the edit bay a non-negotiable standard. During a quarterly review, he surveyed the financial reports. The company was now handling national accounts, with budgets that dwarfed his initial micro-investments. The industry responded. A nomination for a regional documentary award landed on his desk, marking the first time his work received formal external validation. He did not celebrate with a gala or a break in the schedule. He used the attention to secure 3 more long-term contracts, expanding the firm's reach into commercial advertising. He was no longer just filling a gap in the market. He was defining the production standards within it. The weight of this success manifested in the silence of his office after hours. He sat at his desk, The hum of the servers constant, reviewing the growth charts that climbed steadily. He had built the structure he once lacked, creating a machine that functioned with the same intensity he had once applied to his single smartphone. The stage floor vibrated under the heavy bass of the introduction music. Noah walked out, his steps measured, moving from the wings into the blinding white glow of the overhead spotlights. He reached the center, the light hitting his face with a heat that reminded him of the lamps he once jury-rigged in his bedroom. He looked out into the darkness beyond the stage. Hundreds of people sat in the rows, their faces obscured by the glare. He waited. He adjusted the microphone stand, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and scanned the room. The silence was absolute, a heavy, expectant weight that filled the hall. He stood still, hands at his sides, observing the scale of the production surrounding him, the cameras tracking his movement, the massive screens displaying his company logo, and the rows of tech equipment lining the back of the auditorium. He thought of the cracked phone screen on his desk, then looked back at the audience. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, grounding himself in the physical reality of the moment. He looked at the technician in the front row, nodded once, and then shifted his weight, preparing to address the room. Noah finished his final sentence and stepped back from the podium. The applause faded into a low hum of shifting bodies. A hand went up in the third row. A young creator stood, looking toward the stage, holding a notebook that looked worn at the edges. He hesitated, cleared his throat, and the sound echoed through the high ceiling. The auditorium quieted instantly. People leaned forward, straining to hear. The young creator gripped the back of the chair in front of him, his knuckles white. He asked how someone without capital, without a team, or without access to high-end equipment could replicate such a trajectory. He listed the barriers: the lack of investors, the absence of initial funding, and the impossibility of competing with established firms. The question hung in the air, framed as a plea for a financial roadmap. Noah watched him, his hands resting on the edge of the stage. The silence deepened. Every camera operator in the hall turned their lens toward the stage, waiting for a complex answer about market penetration, venture capital, or revenue models. Noah shifted his stance, his eyes fixed on the young creator, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Noah moved his right hand toward his pocket. The fabric bunched as he gripped something inside. He pulled his hand out slowly, bringing it into the light. Between his thumb and forefinger, he held a small, black smartphone. He raised his arm, extending his hand toward the third row where the young creator stood. The device caught the glare of the stage lights. The young creator shifted his weight, blinked, and then let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. The sound traveled across the auditorium, bouncing off the back walls. A few people in the surrounding rows turned their heads, mirroring the creator's confusion. He shook his head, looking at the people nearby as if sharing a private joke, his shoulders relaxing from their rigid posture. He looked back at the stage, his mouth curved into a smirk, expecting a punchline to follow the display. The silence of the rest of the room intensified, turning brittle. Noah did not lower his hand. He kept his arm extended, the phone held steady in the air, creating a visible, physical gap between his offer and the creator's interpretation of it as a mockery. The laughter from the third row lingered for a second, then died against the stillness of the hall. Noah did not blink. His hand remained fixed in the air, the phone held like a weight. He locked his gaze onto the young creator, his jaw set, his features hardening into an expression of absolute, cold focus. The smirk on the young creator's face faltered. He shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the left and right, looking for someone to break the tension. He found no one. The silence in the auditorium grew heavy, pressing down from the rafters. Noah's eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the creator's movements with surgical precision. The creator's shoulders slumped, the initial amusement replaced by a visible, nervous rigidity. He stopped fidgeting. He stopped looking at his peers. He stood frozen, his own hands hanging limp at his sides, pinned by the intensity of the gaze from the stage. Every breath in the room seemed to stop. Noah remained a statue, his arm unwavering, his face a mask of iron. The air grew thin. The light from the ceiling hit the black screen of the phone, reflecting a sharp, clinical glare back into the rows below. The transition from the earlier casual tone to this sudden, brutal gravity was absolute. Noah finally broke the silence. He did not raise his voice or add a flourish to the delivery. He simply pointed his index finger directly at the device still held in his palm. His voice cut through the auditorium, flat and devoid of any doubt. "This is enough." The words echoed, bouncing off the polished wood of the stage and the high ceiling of the hall. He held the phone steady for 3 more seconds, then lowered his arm to his side. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. Across the auditorium, the young creator stood motionless, his hands still at his sides, his eyes fixed on the screen of the phone. In the rows behind him, the audience remained frozen. No one shifted in their seats. No one cleared their throat. The weight of the statement hung in the air, shifting the entire atmosphere of the room from a keynote presentation to a singular, undeniable lesson. Noah stared past the young creator toward the back doors of the hall. He waited for a reaction, but none came. The silence was no longer awkward or nervous. It was heavy with the realization of what he had just communicated. He stood his ground on the stage, a solitary figure against the backdrop, leaving the finality of his words to settle deep into the floorboards. Noah left the stage through the side exit, his pace steady. He walked through the quiet corridors of the building, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum. 10 minutes later, he was behind the desk in his private office. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He reached out and tapped the power button on his workstation. The monitors flared to life, casting a blue glow over his face. He opened the browser and navigated to the secure financial portal. His fingers moved across the keyboard in a rhythmic, practiced cadence. He entered his credentials and waited for the server to authenticate. A loading bar crawled across the screen. He leaned back, watching the cursor blink. The dashboard finally populated, listing the assets of his production firm. He scrolled down to the summary page. The total net worth figure stood out in bold, green text. He leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the digits. $1,100,000. The decimal points clicked into place. He hovered his mouse over the final sum, observing the total. The realization of the climb from a single smartphone to this valuation settled into the quiet of the office. He stared at the screen for a long count, the numbers reflecting in his eyes, confirming the outcome of his work. Noah pushed his keyboard aside, clearing a space on the mahogany surface of his desk. He reached toward the back corner where a small, dark object rested near a stack of files. He picked it up. The phone was light, far lighter than the professional equipment he now used daily. The screen was spiderwebbed with fine, deep cracks that caught the overhead light. He ran his thumb over the jagged edges of the glass. The device was dead. The battery had long since lost its charge, and the casing was scuffed from years of being shoved into pockets and dropped on concrete. He held it in his palm, feeling the cold, smooth plastic against his skin. This was the tool that had recorded his first, shaky experiments. It was the device that had captured his early failures and his first small successes. He turned it over, watching the light play across the damage. The silence of the office deepened. There was no hum of production here, no buzz of cameras, only the weight of the small, broken object in his hand. He placed it back down in the center of the desk, aligning it with the edge of his blotter. It remained there, a quiet, static anchor in the room, contrasting the million-dollar figures still glowing on the monitor just inches away. Noah looked away from the monitor and back to the cracked, silent phone. The path from that cramped bedroom to this office had not been paved with capital or high-end gear. It was paved with the constant, grinding act of solving problems as they appeared. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker below. He realized then that the empire he had built was never about the lenses, the sensors, or the software. It was about the refusal to wait for permission or the perfect set of tools. He had started with nothing but a desire to tell stories, and that desire had forced him to learn, to adapt, and to persist through every technical failure. The phone on his desk was a monument to that grit. It proved that the most valuable asset was not in his bank account, but in his ability to see a path where others saw a wall. He turned back to his desk, took one last look at the device, and felt the weight of the journey settle into clarity. The tools would eventually break. The technology would become obsolete, but the mindset remained. He had proven that anyone with the will to begin possessed everything they needed to build their own future. Resourcefulness was the only currency that truly mattered,